So right now, price to performance is absolutely king in the PC building space, and part of that is because the GPU market right now is just absolutely terrible. Everything is overpriced, and if you can save a buck elsewhere, then you can devote a little bit more money to purchasing that very much overpriced GPU that you do kind of need to actually get up and running and gaming on the PC side of the whole console war. We're not really part of the console war though, are we? As a PC gamer, no. But still, you need a GPU to game, and without a GPU, you're stuck with integrated graphics, which, to be fair, if you have a Ryzen APU, that might be okay to keep you going for a little while, but if you're building a brand new gaming PC, you do probably want a nice GPU, and that's kind of what we're looking at today, is a way to save money elsewhere in the build so that you can devote a little bit more money to a purchase of a GPU. So today, we're gonna be looking at this AliExpress combo featuring a Chinese X99 motherboard, a Xeon E5-2620 V3, that's 6 cores and 12 threads on that CPU, and 16 gigabytes of ECC registered DDR4 memory, which only runs at 1866 megahertz out of the box, and more on that later. So as I mentioned in the intro, we're gonna start with breaking this combo down with that E5-2620 V3. This is a Haswell-based architecture with this CPU, and we have 6 cores and 12 threads running at a base clock of 2.4 gigahertz, and with all the cores hit with a Cinebench workflow, those do boost up to right around 2.6 gigahertz on this particular motherboard at least. Now the single core performance, if you're just running a single core task, does boost higher than 2.6 gigahertz, but if you're hitting all the cores at once, then 2.6 gigahertz is where you're gonna end up being. Now if you've looked at recent CPUs, especially ones geared towards gaming on the mainstream, whether it's Ryzen or Intel's Core i5s, i7s, or even i9s, you will know that 2.4 to 2.6 gigahertz is a really low clock speed for 2021, but this Haswell does make up for at least a little bit with those 6 cores and 12 threads. And in theory, as games take more and more advantage of cores and threads, which we've definitely been seeing over the last couple of years, that actually should breathe more life back into some of these older Xeon CPUs that may have lower clock speeds overall, but do have a lot of cores and threads to go with those lower clock speeds. So even though the clock speed definitely hurts us here, the 6 cores and 12 threads, as opposed to something else on the mainstream Haswell platform like 4 cores and 8 threads, those extra cores and threads should help us out a little bit. Moving over to the motherboard in this particular combo, it's actually, first of all, quite an attractive looking motherboard with a white PCB. It kind of has a unique flair while still maintaining a generally neutral look to it. It does feature 4 DIMM slots for those RAM sticks, which this particular combo comes with a 2x8 gigabyte configuration, and it does run in dual channel mode out of the box. And it is worth noting the RAM and CPU were both pre-installed. They didn't come separately. They all came in the motherboard box, and they were all pre-installed. So there was no assembly when it comes to the CPU or RAM side of this. The VRMs on this particular motherboard are modest, to say the least, but with a Cinebench load on the CPU and a thermal probe placed under the VRM heatsink, I read just 53.6 degrees Celsius at that point beneath the heatsink and above the VRM. So while I wouldn't recommend this motherboard for higher end X99 CPUs, with this 6 core and 12 threaded 2620 V3, it's just fine, and I don't see any problem running this CPU at full tilt for an extended period of time with this VRM setup. In addition, we get some nice added value through the inclusion of 2 M.2 slots, as well as a location to add in a Wi-Fi card. My testing was run on a SATA 2.5-inch SSD, but the inclusion of M.2 allows builders a much simpler build process that cuts out some of the headache that goes with managing SATA cables throughout a chassis. It's also worth noting that the motherboard has an AMD style cooler mounting ring included with the combo. This makes throwing on a cooler like the Snowman cooler, which I've covered recently in a couple of videos, or any tower style CPU heatsink that uses those AMD stock clips, super simple. Another item that's definitely worth noting with these Chinese motherboards featuring reclaimed older Intel chipsets, this motherboard supports normal sleep mode in Windows. On previous Chinese boards that I've looked at, the sleep mode in Windows sent the system into a pseudo sleep mode where the fans would ramp up to about 100%, and the previous solution was just to put it into hibernate mode instead. With this motherboard, sleep mode works just fine, so feel free to use your normal sleep mode and not have to worry about the fans going crazy. Finally, we need to talk about the memory kit included in this combo. Out of the box, the motherboard will automatically run the memory at just 1866 megahertz. The testing I conducted, which we'll get into in just a minute, was run at that stock speed of 1866 megahertz. Now, if you're looking for just a little bit of free performance that would come out of the box that does require you to dive into the BIOS, with just one setting in the BIOS, you can bump that memory speed up to 2133 megahertz and everything works just fine. So your results will definitely vary depending on what memory kit you get shipped, but with my memory kit that worked just fine and it was just a little bit of free performance. Now it's not going to be game-changing performance because this is still somewhat slow ECC registered RAM, but it is a little bit of free performance. I ran things out of the box because I wanted to see what the end consumer would get, especially somebody that doesn't necessarily know the ins and out of hopping into BIOS settings in general. I wanted to see what performance was like for those types of people that are just looking for a cheap way to build a system and don't necessarily want to be diving into the BIOS to tweak everything to get the most performance out of the system. Now for the GPU, we're running with a GTX 1070 for testing, and that's mostly because, especially right now with the way the market is, I don't think you would want to run this particular combination with anything higher end than a GTX 1070, which already costs around $300 on the used market right now. And I don't think there's a lot of people that are going to be spending more than $300 on a GPU and pairing it with an older and somewhat slower 6-core 12-threaded Xeon. If you are someone that's doing that, hey, more power to you. I just don't think most consumers are going to be looking for a super high-end GPU with a lower end motherboard CPU RAM combination. And with that, on to the games. So starting off with Fortnite at 1080p, the average FPS here was 191 with a 1% low of 111. And yeah, this was a great experience. In fact, I was pleasantly surprised because I expected to see a little bit more stuttering than I did see with this combination. Obviously, the GTX 1070 was just slightly limited with this particular CPU in its highest frame rates, but the CPU had no problem running the game at well over 100 FPS, and with that GPU not actually bottlenecking the CPU, it really being more bottlenecked by the CPU, you could get away with running with higher graphics presets while still not harming your frame rate overall, because that CPU is what's limiting us here, and you can shift a little bit of that load over to the GPU by upping some of those graphical settings. Overwatch was another title that ran exceptionally well in this particular test. At 1080p on the medium preset, we saw an average FPS of 160 and a 1% low of 110 FPS. Again, extremely smooth on the experience side of things. There was absolutely no problem. If you were playing this title with this combination between the CPU, the RAM, and the GPU, you would honestly think you're playing on a pretty high-end system because there was no stuttering to speak of. So again, with this esports title, this is absolutely an excellent experience. Now moving over to some AAA titles, this is where it gets a little bit interesting to me because we start to put more of the load on the GPU than the CPU. In Red Dead Redemption 2, for instance, on high settings at 1080p, the average FPS was just 37 with a 1% low of 32. Now the nice thing about Red Dead Redemption 2, at least the built-in benchmark, is that everything remains pretty consistent. So even though those numbers are quite low and definitely lower than I would recommend, I would actually definitely drop the settings in this title to get more frames. You're not really missing out on a lot by using this CPU as opposed to something a little bit more modern like a Ryzen 5600X, because the main bottleneck here is still the GPU. So this title is definitely in playable state at high settings at 1080p if you're somebody that only really requires 30 FPS. If you're looking more for something closer to 60 FPS, drop those settings down a little bit and alleviate some of that bottleneck off of the GTX 1070, and you would still have a very good experience, albeit with slightly less eye candy. And everything I said about Red Dead Redemption 2 sort of applies here to Cyberpunk 2077 as well. Now Cyberpunk was run at 1080p medium preset here, and basically the same thing applies though, where the bottleneck isn't necessarily on the CPU. Now the frame time consistency wasn't quite as good in Cyberpunk, with the average being at 54 and the 1% low being there at 37, but this was still a very playable experience. I only really saw something like one major stutter, and it was when I was driving around a little bit and I was moving into a different area that I saw this stutter. So there may be some stuttering that goes along with the E5 2620 V3, but for the most part, this is a very good experience still, being that this is a slower paced game. It's not a rapid esports style shooter like you might see with Overwatch or Fortnite. So Cyberpunk 2077 absolutely playable on this E5 2620 V3. And finally, in the Dubai benchmark here on Hitman 3, 1080p high settings, again, an excellent experience. Hitman 3 seems to be quite well optimized in general, at least it runs pretty well for a game that just released. So I saw an average FPS here of 98 with the GTX 1070 with the 2620 V3 and a 1% low there at 73. So this was a really smooth experience, and really that 1% low again would be likely higher, except with the Hitman 3 built-in benchmark, every time the scene transitions a little bit you see a spike in frame times. So without those transitions you would actually see a more consistent frame time. So even though there is a significant drop from the average to the 1% low, that's really not something to be concerned about. This title runs very well on this combination. And finally, just to give you an idea of how this CPU compares to other CPUs that you may consider instead of a cheap combination like this one, the multi-core performance in Cinebench R23 was 4,714 and the single core performance was 740. So at the end of the day, this combo presents a very interesting decision for builders to make here in early 2021. You can definitely save some serious money over buying a newer CPU, motherboard, and RAM all separately, and modern games taking advantage of more cores and more threads actually keeps things like the 2620 V3 competent at gaming even in modern demanding titles. Realistically, you won't want to run this in a super high-end system, but as a way to get up and running without much compromise while also saving some money, this is a great way to shave some cost on the base platform to free up money to buy a better GPU. You even keep an upgrade path, as there are other reasonably priced Xeon CPUs on this platform that feature more cores, higher clock speeds, or possibly both. But those are just my thoughts on what actually turned out to be an excellent value motherboard, RAM, and CPU combo. But let me know what you think of the value presented here, especially those of you that actually own one of these combos or a similar combo to this. Let us know all your thoughts in those comments down below. And as always, if you like this video, give it a like, share, subscribe, and comment. All those things are very helpful for the channel. You can follow me both on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware, and as always, I'll let YouTube queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane with Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you guys in the next video.